So in this video, we're going to talk about Richard Dormer's play Drumbelly, which I'm reading out of Contemporary Irish Plays, which is a Methuen drama collection. So this is a mafia play. The Irish mafia was incredibly powerful and influential. Going back really to the 1800s, Irish street gangs were significantly important. And then by the time you get to the Prohibition era, the Irish mafia competed with the Italian mafia, Jewish mafia, and other sort of ethnically organized criminal syndicates in places like New York, where this play is set, Chicago, Boston, other places like this, places particularly with large Irish-American populations. And ultimately, that's kind of what the play is really interested in, is the Irish-American experience. And this, because I think this is one of the things. So Dormer is an Irish playwright. He's from Northern Ireland. I looked up where he's from, and I've forgotten. I want to say County Down, but I forget what town specifically. But I think it's always really interesting to see Irish perspectives on the Irish-American experience, because in many ways, almost like the distinction between African-American culture and African cultures, the distinction between the Irish experience and the Irish-American experience is really kind of a stark one. And in many ways, Irish-Americans a long history of fetishizing Irishness. And I mean, I'm part Irish-American, and I've got my, you're not going to be able to see this very well, but I've got my Harp of Erin buttons on this jacket. I've got my Moore coat of arms pin. That's David Moore was my Irish ancestor that we know of. I've got another sort of Harp of Erin pin up here. So there is this long tradition of fetishizing Irishness. And St. Patrick's Day, I think, is a really good example of this, because traditionally in Ireland, St. Patrick's Day, prior to the past couple of decades maybe, was a fairly low-key, staid religious holiday. But in the US, it was parades, it was confetti, it was green beer and Kiss Me, I'm Irish t-shirts and all this stuff. And that was about sort of solidifying an Irish-American identity rooted in this idea of Irishness and sort of glomming on to these symbols of Ireland. And it simply wasn't quite the same thing in Ireland itself. I mean, at moments of high nationalism, like the War for Independence, the Celtic Revival, things like this, there were these sort of attachments to Irish things, but they tended to be more politically and practically motivated. Whereas Irish-American identity was a sort of ethnic motivation. It was about defining Irish-Americans as a distinct ethnic group through, again, this really fetishization of Ireland, this idea of, like, the old sod and all that. And so it's very interesting to me to read Irish literature about the Irish-American experience and worldview and see how actual Irish people tend to understand this approach that Irish-Americans take. And so that's one central element of this play. So I'll talk you through the plot line briefly, although in some ways it seems to me like the plot line is somewhat secondary, because the main conflict of the play seems less important than these sort of questions of identity. So we have Sullivan, I'm going to look back at the cast list to get the first names of these characters. Gulliver Sullivan, who's the leader of the Irish Mafia in this section of Brooklyn. Sullivan is making a peace deal with Marconi, who's the leader of the Italian Mafia in this section of Brooklyn. They have been in conflict for a while, but now Marconi wants to put an end to it, and so he has dispatched $100,000 as a payment to Sullivan in order to make peace. We open with actually a guy named Harvey Marr, who's recounting to Walter Sorrow this experience that he has had where he has shot a postman for laughing at him. Marr was drunk, and this is the first time we really sort of get this indication of the fetishization of Ireland or Irish culture, because Marr was really drunk. He was urinating on street, or off the edge of a street, I guess, and he looked down, and he realized that he was urinating onto a lawn gnome, specifically a leprechaun lawn gnome, and he says to Sorrow that he was just filled with this rage about the fact that he was peeing on a leprechaun, and it was this symbol of Ireland. And he just starts, like, shouting at the houses that these people are racist for putting this leprechaun out where he would eventually pee. And then he sees this postman who's, like, staring at him and then just starts laughing at him. And so Marr shoots him in the head. And then Sorrow, apparently Sorrow's job is basically just to cut up bodies and dispose of them for the Irish Mafia. So that's all we really get about that character. So that's where we start. Much of the actual play itself, much of the body of the play, revolves around Johnny Rourke, called a.k.a. The Fox, Willie Wicklow Hill, Daniel Antrim Malley, and Thomas Lumpy Flanagan. So these are just a set of gangsters who work for Sullivan. Wicklow, Antrim, and Lumpy are sort of just foot soldiers, but Rourke is a bit more sort of high-ranked, and he's kind of put in charge of Bobby Boy, who's a young kid, Mr. Sullivan's initially presented as his nephew. We later find out he's likely Sullivan's son. But Bobby has come over from Belfast. This is 1969, remember, so that's kind of an important thing. But Bobby has come over from Belfast, and he's sort of put in Rourke's care. And the idea ultimately is that Bobby will sort of join the organization. There's also Chief Marion O'Hare, the NYPD chief. He is eventually, so he's sort of borderline there. He is allied with Sullivan, but he also seems somewhat not fully on board. So a lot of this is just sort of a Reservoir Dogs is a good sort of comparison for much of what goes on in the play. There's some casual violence. There's some discussions, semi-deep discussions about language, about humanity's ability to go to the moon, because this is 1969. And actually, while Wicklow, Antrim, and Lumpy are kicking to death a guy named Hennessy, who's badmouthed Sullivan, Rourke is actually watching the moon landing as it happens. So these events are contemporaneous. Um, Sullivan is perturbed because the $100,000 that Marconi was supposed to have sent over yesterday has not arrived. And so they try and figure out what happened. The two guys that Marconi had sent, Mickey Nono and the other guy's name is Manfredi. They have disappeared. The car has disappeared. The money has disappeared. So Sullivan sends out his dudes to figure out what has happened to it. What it turns out, ironically enough, so Harvey Marr, who had killed the postman, he basically came to Sullivan and sort of made amends for causing this trouble. What it turned out, ironically enough, is that the postman that Harvey killed and then burned his stuff was Manfredi, disguised as a postman, to try and elude the FBI. And so Marr, in a drunken, nonsensical rage, shot Manfredi in the head, and then burned the $100,000 that was supposed to make peace between Sullivan's Irish mafia and Marconi's Italian mafia. You know, it's a wacky world sometimes. And so Sullivan is clearly not pleased with this, and then we sort of end with Marr in a church praying for forgiveness for this thing that he has done, knowing that he is going to be executed. So, the thing that I think is really most interesting. So there's a couple of things. One, I think the 1969 date is really interesting. It's a good choice because, again, it is this sort of weird juxtaposition between what's going on in the United States with the moon landing, which is really central here, and of course things like the civil rights movement, women's liberation, the anti-Vietnam movement. These aren't mentioned in the play, but it is worth keeping them in mind because they complicate this dichotomy. But this idea of the moon landing is like, humans are an amazing species. Rourke is really interested in this idea that, like, the things we can achieve are incredible. And then we've got 1969 in Belfast, which, for anybody who knows anything about modern Irish history, 1969 is a crucial date because this is sort of the official start of the Troubles. So the sectarian violence between largely Protestant Unionists who support Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom and the largely Catholic Republicans who supported Northern Ireland joining the Republic of Ireland. Decades of sectarian violence. It's been said that in Belfast in the 70s and 80s, there was not a day that went by without a bombing, without a shooting, without a stabbing. I mean, this was just a continual cycle of violence. One of the most brutal periods of civilian and paramilitary violence in Irish history. And so the idea that Bobby is fleeing Belfast in 1969 because of some violence is significant here. Like, again, we've got this sort of contrast between the technological marvel of the moon landing versus what audiences of this play would clearly know was the coming Troubles. And again, Dormer is from Northern Ireland, so this would have been part of his experience growing up. I don't know how old he is. He's not all that old, but he probably would have been born prior to the Good Friday Agreement. Though how much he really sort of came of age in the period of the Troubles, I'm not sure, because I don't remember how old he is. I don't remember when he was born. But regardless, even for people born after the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the Troubles would be a formative part of their recent history. So that's one element I think is really interesting here, is this sort of contrast between the technological advancement represented by the moon landing versus the violence of the Troubles, but also of gang violence here. I mean, again, we have a number of people beaten, murdered, just killed in various ways, whether that's shot, stabbed, kicked to death, etc., etc. So we've got those contrasts. But the other thing, again, is this fascination with the way that the Irish American experience works, and what is sort of shaped by what that's sort of shaped by, this way of looking at Ireland. So I think the key bit here, if I was going to point to a particular passage and say this is the most important thing about this play and its conceptualization of the Irish American experience, Sullivan is talking to Bobby, and he says, "You leave Ireland, Bobby, but you never really leave it. It's always there. It's like the moon, always with you, even when you can't see it. It's like it's got a pull on you. I know a lot of men here who pine for it, and they've never even been there." So that sort of idea of like the Irish American experience is an experience of being pulled back toward Ireland. It's a diasporic experience in that sense, in a sort of true sense of the word. Jews have a similar experience. I had a professor once in a modern Jewish history course who he was a rabbi, and the way that he put it, his synagogue was in Winchester, Virginia. The way that he put it was, we have 1 foot in Winchester and 1 foot in Babylon. And I think that's very true of the Jewish experience, but it's also true of the Irish American experience. And I think of the Irish experience in places like Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and other places that large numbers of Irish migrants went to. This idea that we have 1 foot in the U.S. and we have 1 foot in Ireland, I think, is very, very true for a lot of Irish Americans. But it's this interesting idea of this sort of, like, it flattens out Ireland in a way, the way that these characters conceptualize the country. Because just before this, shortly before, Sullivan gets Bobby to stamp his foot on the ground in his apartment. And he says here, "Feels good, doesn't it? You know why? Under your feet, that's turf from Kildare, horse country. There's an energy in it. I had it shipped over from home. A little bit of home. These trees, apple tree from County Armagh, apple country, ecclesiastical capital of Ireland. Ash tree from Fermanagh. That's a blackthorn from Letterkenny, County Donegal. That's a sapling oak from County Cavan. I don't know where that is, but it's somewhere in the middle. Lavender from County Clare. Put this under your pillow, helps you sleep. Laurel tree from Hillsborough, County Down. Nasturtium, I don't know how to pronounce that word, sorry. From a window box in Derry City, the walled city. This is my little bit of home. My little piece of Eden. This is home." So what's interesting about this is that these are very different places in Ireland with very different cultures, very different traditions. There are big cultural difference. Well, there are noticeable cultural differences, we'll put it that way, between, say, Southwest Ireland and the Central Midlands. They have different cultures, they have different experiences, and of course some of the counties mentioned here are in Northern Ireland, which has a very different experience and history. It, even by 1969, certainly has a very different experience and history than counties in the Republic of Ireland. So this is, again, this sort of pan-Irish conceptualization that ignores the realities of differences within Ireland itself, but also sort of ignores it ignores the variety of Irish experiences to flatten out Éirinn into one sort of unified culture. But we also have this odd contrast earlier on where, again, it's sort of our attention is drawn to the fact that this is the Irish-American experience as opposed to the Irish experience. Because Wicklow, in one of the early scenes where they're just sort of hanging around talking about language, says that he met a guy from Cork, which is Southern Ireland, Southwest Ireland, and he says here, so he asks me for a light. I swear to God, God forgive me, I couldn't understand a fucking word. Rourke says, yeah. Wicklow says, it was just noise. And then he does his impression of a Cork accent, which I'm not going to do. But, so it is this sort of, again, this weird, fascinating thing where, like, as an Irish playwright, Dormer seems very keenly aware of how fetishistic and detached from the reality of Ireland, the Irish-American approach to Ireland is oftentimes.